Andy Thomas, thanks for joining us.
Good to be with you, Darren.
Look, I know I want to talk to you about the future of space travel, but first of all, we just go back a little bit. You're a veteran of what, four space missions?
4 shuttle missions, that's correct. First in 1996 and my last in 2005.
Yeah, and during those ones, I think you trained in Russia, and then you went up on the Mir, on the space shuttle there. How long did you spend, the longest time did you spend in space?
Yes, that was my second flight, preceded by a year training in Russia, essentially to become a cosmonaut. And then I joined the 2 Russian cosmonauts on the Mir space station, where I lived for 20 weeks. And it was a daunting prospect, but it turned out to be a great adventure. It was probably the high point of my professional career, I'd have to say.
Well, when you think spending 20 weeks in weightlessness up there, how long did it take you once you got back to Earth, when you came down to Earth, to get life back to normal?
Yeah, it was an adjustment. The first time I stood up on the flight deck of the shuttle after we landed was the most bizarre sensation I can tell you. I felt gravity as if I'd never felt gravity before in my life. And I couldn't believe the effort required to put one foot in front of the other just to walk. It was the most bizarre sensation. But you bounce back. After a few hours, you bounce back and you start to feel normal reasonably quickly. It's amazing how adaptive the human body is. But even a month after flying, they did some careful balance tests on me and found that there were still residual effects from being in zero gravity for that length of time. And I had a lot of muscle aches and pains, as you can imagine, because these muscles that you normally use on a day-to-day basis here on the ground essentially take a holiday for 20 weeks, and then when you put them back to work, they complain, and you know it. You feel like you've run a marathon without training for it.
So would you rush, the muscles run the risk of atrophying or something like that, or do you do a lot of exercise even though you're in weightlessness?
Yes, that is the crux of the problem. The muscles and the bones that support the muscles weaken if they're not used. It's the response to stress that maintains muscle strength and bone strength. And I might add also cardiovascular strength. And that's why we have a very strict exercise regime for those people on orbit to maintain muscle tone and maintain cardiovascular health. It's about 2 hours per day allocated for exercise, and that includes prep time and cleanup time. But you need to be ready to step up to a lot of exercise if you're going to do one of these missions. Because if we ever send people to Mars, we need them to arrive in a healthy condition when they get there, and exercise is essential to do that.
Yeah. Now, speaking of Mars, there's various trains of thought. One is that you should go back to the Moon and then launch from the Moon to go to Mars. The other one is to go straight from Earth to Mars. What's your feeling about that?
Actually, there's a third option. You go to the Moon first to shake out the operations of spacecraft in a deep space environment, get some understanding of working on another planetary body, and then you build a craft based on that experience base to take you from Earth orbit to Mars. And I think that scenario is the way it's likely to play out. And I don't think it's actually so much an engineering challenge today as one of political will. We need the political will to do it. I think almost certainly it won't be an undertaking by one nation, the US, like Apollo was. It will be an undertaking by multiple nations and an international collaboration, the same kind of international collaboration that we have today with the International Space Station.
Well, pardon my naivete here, but I've been to the Kennedy Space Centre in Cape Kennedy, and I've seen how big, and Cape Canaveral, so how big an operation it was. How on earth can you get all that material onto the Moon to launch from there?
Well, you don't actually launch from the Moon. There are scenarios in which that's possible, but that requires a very sophisticated infrastructure. I think that's what you're alluding to. You need a lot of infrastructure and support equipment on the surface of the Moon, which is a prodigious cost. I would see going to the Moon as to develop the experience base of being on another planetary body and operating spacecraft in deep space, but fundamentally you would assemble your Mars transit spacecraft in an Earth orbit, or perhaps a high Earth orbit, and leave from Earth orbit.
Now, Andy, we just celebrated the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11. Back then in 1969, a lot of people, me included, thought that by now the Moon would have been colonised by somebody, by the Americans, by the Russians, by the Americans, the Chinese, even the Indians are on their way now. Why do you think it didn't happen?
Yes, it's a good question, because if the pace of the 60s had been sustained, we almost certainly would have colonies on the moon now, if not colonies or at least landings on Mars, and that was what everyone thought was going to happen. But the pace was not sustained, and it wasn't a sustainable pace to begin with. The pace that Apollo was developed and succeeded under was established as a national priority, and it was a culmination of many geopolitical, social and cultural events that were sort of a perfect storm of events that gave rise to the success of the Apollo program. And we haven't seen that kind of motivation and willpower as in national space policy since, and there hasn't been the funding, and that's why we haven't seen the same kind of pace of development.
Yeah. Now you're one of the very few people in the world that can say this, but you've walked in space. You've been outside the space shuttle for, what, 6.5 hours on one occasion. What was the experience of doing that?
It was pretty humbling. I remember after we depressurized the airlock and I opened the hatch to go outside, everything looked very familiar to me because we'd trained for it in high-fidelity mock-up, so it all had an air of familiarity. Handrails were where I expected them to be, and tether points were where I expected them to be, and all the sights were familiar. Yet I knew that there was only about a 3-millimeter thick plastic visor separating me from the infinity of space. So it was an oh gosh moment, I have to say. But then I got into the swing of the work routine. We had a very carefully scripted series of tasks to do, and I got into it, and it actually had an air of familiarity the whole time, simply because we'd trained so hard and so much in high-fidelity mock-ups, simulating being weightless by being underwater. The big difference, of course, was that up there was a spectacular view, and I remember one time we were on the dark side of the Earth, and I looked out, I could see the space station supported, just hanging in the blackness of space, and I knew I was looking towards infinity. It was really a humbling moment.
Would be. Now, this is a long way from when you were a kid. I read that you made space rockets when you were a child in Adelaide, and then you become an astronaut, and you marry an astronaut, and I presume that's why you live in Houston now.
That's correct. I was a kid growing up in Adelaide. I had an interest, as many kids did, in model aeroplanes. When the space program started, that interest morphed into an interest in rocketry and spacecraft, and I followed the early space flights with avid interest. Little expecting that I would one day get to do it myself. And I remember watching the moon landing thinking, what a great adventure. Wouldn't it be amazing to do something like that? But I didn't consider it a realistic prospect. I mean, what are the odds for a kid from Adelaide? It wasn't until later in my professional career working in the aerospace industry, after I'd got some educational credentials, that I realized I was actually able to make that dream a reality. And I pursued it then, and led me to being selected in 1992 in the 14th group of astronaut selections, and that was one of the great moments of my life, as you can probably imagine. I remember getting the phone call saying that I'd been chosen to become an astronaut, and I knew at that moment that my life had changed in unpredictable ways forever.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but your wife has flown in space, hasn't she?
Yeah, she flew some years ago on the space station, a 6-month mission. She is a native-born Texan, and she's still in the flight program. She's still with NASA. She's a branch chief within the astronaut office. All the space station crews report to her, and she's in line to fly again, and we're hoping that in the next year or two we'll see that happen.
Yeah, so good luck. Congratulations to her and to you. It's a pleasure to meet up with you again and to talk to you. Thanks for your time.
My pleasure. Good to chat.